Welcome to Onward and Upward, Citizen Climate Lobby Ontario's Carbon Pricing Conference and Lobby Day. We are going back to Queen's Park in Toronto for the third time with an appreciation for carbon pricing in Ontario and to empower our members of provincial parliament to keep hiking the carbon price past 2022 and to keep coordinating the price nationally so that Canada can enact border tax adjustments. Ultimately, Ontario, Canada, and the world needs a carbon price of at least $150 a ton by 2030. This is going to require unprecedented cooperation from our provinces, territories, and federal government. We need border tax adjustments to level the playing field with countries that don't have equivalent carbon prices and to urge them to get carbon prices as well. For the long-term viability of any carbon pricing policy, it has to be void of inducing cynicism, and it must be as impervious as possible against populist attacks. There has to be political will for the carbon pricing policy. And whose specialty is political will? Citizens Climate Lobby. Most importantly, many of us in this room are more than just environmental activists. We are social justice activists as well. And this carbon pricing policy must protect the poor and middle class. Have no doubt that tomorrow you will be speaking for millions. Thank you for being here tonight. I am very happy to announce our keynote speaker of the evening. It's Nancy Palardy, Senior Manager of Climate Change at the Office of the Commissioner of Ontario. Nancy works with the climate change team, focusing on mitigation, carbon pricing, and transportation policy. Prior to joining the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's office, she worked as an oil and gas analyst for Jansi Research, researching environmental, social, and governance performance of companies for institutional investors. She coordinated the ecological justice and corporate engagement programs for Kairos. In this capacity, she led shareholder engagement strategy focused on the disclosure of climate change risks and liabilities of Canadian oil companies. In the past, she has served as the board member of the Ontario Natural Food Co-op and is currently on the Service Canada board. In her spare time, Nancy enjoys time outdoors with her husband and 2 children, especially when that involves long-distance bicycle touring, hiking, and camping. She is currently working towards her black belt in karate, but that's a really long-term goal. And we like to have a long-term vision here at Citizen Climate Lobby, so thank you, Nancy, for being here tonight.
Kathy. Let me just start my timer here because I don't want to go over time. That might happen, so it's good to have a timer in front of me. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight because what you're doing is probably the most important thing that can be done on climate change. We need to let people know, we need to let the politicians know that it's an important issue, and what you're doing is really critical work in that area. So you'll see at the end of my slide that that's what I encourage, that our office encourages people to do, but you're doing it, so I don't need to tell you that. So the first thing I wanted to start with is, can I just get a sense, is how many people know what the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, our office is, just so I have a sense of the audience? Okay, so sort of half and half. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna walk you through who we are, what we do, and then I'm going to talk a bit about, for this audience, probably you don't need me to run so much through the science of climate change, but I am going to go through a bit of that. And then I'm going to talk about what has happened in the past year in terms of climate policy in Ontario. So the first thing is, who is the ECO? Why are we so passionate about climate change? And what is Ontario doing? So the first question is, well, who is the ECO? Who is the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario? So the best way to think about our office is we are similar to the Ombudsman or the Auditor General. We're an independent, our office is an independent office of the Legislative Assembly. The current commissioner is Diane Sachs. She's a lawyer who's been in private practice for about 40 years. And what we do is, under the Environmental Bill of Rights, which is a piece of legislation in Ontario that gives the citizens of Ontario various rights, we have several requirements. Effectively, the best way to think about it is we're the watchdog on the environment for Ontario. So one of our requirements is to report on progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the province, and that's the report that I'm going to walk you through in a bit. We also do reports on energy conservation and environmental protection. So we have a legislated obligation to report to the Speaker of the Assembly on these various issues. So here's some of the reports that we released in the past year. The energy conservation report, the climate report, which is, I brought copies of it here, and on our general environmental report. So why are we so passionate about climate change? Now, for people who have already heard, know Diane Sachs, who is the commissioner. The best way to explain this is Diane went to Paris. She was appointed in December 2015. She went to Paris and really came back shocked at the state of the science and what is going on in terms of climate change. So Diane has been a one-woman force to be reckoned with in the last little while on climate change. And so she's come back, and our office, obviously, this is a key issue that we focus on. So I probably don't need to run through much of the science with the people in the room. We all know, the scientists agree. We all know it's human caused. We know it's serious. We know it's greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we know it's real. But the other thing, as Diane has experienced, and she's done a lot more of these talks going across the province, is as she talks to people, she realizes now, and our office has come to recognize, that most people don't have any sense of the rapidity of change that is going on around the world and what's happening. So the last 12 months are off the charts. There's a lot of money to be invested, both in opportunities and threats. And we're running out of time. So why are we running out of time? Well, we all know this, highest CO2 emissions ever, and they just keep going up. And where does the carbon go? Again, I don't need to educate this audience, I'm sure, but there's the sources on the left-hand side and the sinks on the right-hand side. So we know it comes from fossil fuel burning, and we know it comes from cutting down trees. And where does it go and get absorbed into the atmosphere and trees and the oceans? So over time, we all know the curve from Mauna Loa in Hawaii that shows the Earth breathing, right? The annual uptake, emissions up and down with the carbon dioxide. So that's the Earth breathing. But as you can see, it's been a steady upward climb. And I'm going to assume everyone knows that we have significantly exceeded what is often referred to as the safe threshold of 350 parts per million. We're now above 400 parts per million, and we probably will be permanently above 400 parts per million. And it's not just carbon dioxide, and we hear a lot about carbon dioxide because that is the main greenhouse gas. But you can see here that that's the CO2, but here's the methane, and there's the nitrous oxide, and there's all the CFCs and some other gases. So some of these other gases are contributing significantly, and with the science of climate change, we know that a lot of them have a far more serious impact than carbon dioxide. So we're experiencing the highest temperatures in human history. And so this is a map of the surface level temperatures of the globe. So we see, for the most part, we see the globe is warming. Now, if you've seen this presentation, you're not allowed to shout out the answer. So Francis, I know you've seen this before. So what does this represent here? So we see we see some cooling spots. Well, what is that representing? Kathy? That's right. That's the ocean temperatures. This is in the ocean, and this is the ice melting off of Greenland going into the ocean. So you have colder water going in. And here's the ice caps here melting. So those are really effectively the only areas on the planet where we're seeing cooler than average temperatures. So the science is, when you release the greenhouse gases, they cause the trapping of the heat in the atmosphere. But we're only trapping about 1% of that heat in the air. So where does the rest of the heat go? 93% of the extra heat is in the oceans. So here's the upper ocean levels, the lower level. Here's the sea ice, land. Here's the atmosphere. And what happens when you warm water? Well, it expands, right? So we're seeing the ocean levels are rising, in part because of the melting of the ice, but primarily because warmer water takes up more space. And we're also seeing, again, we're seeing the land is absorbing a lot of the heat that's coming in, and you're seeing differential where those are higher temperatures in Greenland than we've ever seen before. So with higher sea levels, with increased temperature, with increased evaporation, we're getting wilder storms. So for the actuaries and the ones who enjoy this kind of stuff in the room, so this is one chart that tries to explain what's going on, and this is the anomalies. So this isn't temperature, but this is deviation from the average over time. And so I think the scale here, I forgot to put it, I think it's 1920 to 1980. I'm not sure if that, if you assume that that's the average temperatures and then you map the anomalies against that average. So we see earlier in the century, in the 1800s, cooler than average. And then you start to see a little warmer than average. So these are the anomalies based against the average. And so here you can see anomaly. And that to me represents a pretty clear direction. Again, a different way of expressing it. This is one that James Hansen and his team produces. They track the temperature anomalies, again, from 1951 to 1980, the deviation from the mean. So basically what this is saying here is 1951 to 1980, this is a standard deviation curve. You have events. If I'm explaining this wrong, actuaries, please jump in and correct me, but you have a normal distribution curve. And so you have some temperatures, some anomalous events that are cooler than normal. Here's the standard. Here's the events that are warmer than normal. So it's a standard deviation curve. As we move to the right, the curve remains here. This is our normal distribution curve, but things are moving over. So in other words, events at the tail end here that used to be rare are becoming more common. Did I explain that well? So so when people say, and we had this conversation at dinner time, when people say, well, you can't prove that something is, is that climate change? Is that one event climate change? Well, maybe not. But it falls here in a greater likelihood of occurring because of climate change. So let's look at Ontario. What's going on in Ontario? Because that's where we play. Ontario frost-free season. This is information that we got from York University. They have a great lab up there that does a lot of modeling. Frost-free season in Ontario, it's increasing by 1 to 13 days each decade. The interesting thing, though, is, of course, it depends on where you are. So because we're the Ontario Commissioner, we focus on Ontario. So the issue for Ontario is not when, but if. It's not if, but when. And so we're seeing milder winters. That has a significant impact on Native communities up north that rely on ice roads. Wetter springs, faster melts, hotter, drier summers, storms, floods, etc. And so there's an image of the drought 2016 in Ontario, a lot of the dry areas where there were significant water shortages. And we know that there's been an increase in catastrophic losses. And so this is from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and it's in 2015 constant dollars. So you see some of these events that we talked about over dinner. There's the Fort McMurray fire. Here's the Toronto, Alberta floods, and some other things. And so you see the trend increasing like that. Now, these are just the insured losses. The uninsured losses are not represented here. So, sorry, I guess I'm out of order a little bit. But again, other issues in Ontario is in line to face: infectious diseases, extreme weather events, poor air quality, and water stress. And so we are seeing the vector-borne diseases start to move north. some of the modeling that, again, from York University is we've seen these kinds of models globally, internationally through the IPCC reports. This is one that was done for Ontario by LAMPS. And again, this represents different pathways. These RCP stands for representative concentration pathways. So each of these represents a possible pathway for the future, depending on future emissions. And so RCP 2.6 is the low emission scenario. So you see it trending along in here. And the up and down just is a lot of model runs that get done. But this is the average that happens when you average all of the model runs out. And so you see this is the temperature. So projected increase over time. How much worse is it going to get? Well, it depends on emissions. And then we look at global emissions. And we see that they still are going up by virtue of burning, continuing to burn, coal, oil, gas. I mean, here's our good news story that we often hear about. We say, solar and wind are coming along, and they are. I mean, they're growing in leaps and bounds, but we still have an enormous amount of fossil fuel coming on stream. So the question then is, this is what has happened. And what else is not being paid attention to, or is not always factored into some of the IPCC modeling? One of the things that was not included in the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does the reports. So one of the things included, a lot of people aren't aware of this, in the last report of the IPCC was some of the less certain science that was emerging at the time. So one of the things that was not included was the melting of the permafrost. The melting of the permafrost was not included in the models because the science wasn't sufficiently robust. It's a very complicated area. So the permafrost melting with this, which has vast quantities of CO2 stored in it, wasn't modeled in. Soil carbon loss, forest dieback. I'm not saying these others weren't modeled, but the permafrost was. Ocean current changes, loss of sea ice. So these are tipping points. I mean, what we're talking about is lots of carbon that could be released that could lead us over a precipice. So what would that look like? Right? What would that look like? Well, this is what we think it would look like. This is global sea ice. So, here's every year. So here's, 1978, whatever color that is here in January, February, March. So these are all the years and the different months of each one of those years. Well, here's the recent data. Now, if that doesn't look like a tipping point, I don't know what does. That's the precipice. So, is it too late? We're in for big changes. There is still on what's coming, and our choices matter right now. I don't need to tell this audience that, right? This is why you're here. So what is Ontario doing? So Commissioner of Ontario, this is what. So our mandate is to report on progress of the government in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the province. So for years, so I've been in this position since about 2008. That was the Climate Change Action Plan. There was lots of fanfare. We were very excited. We thought they were moving forward with the price on carbon, and then what happened? We had the collapse. So my job went kind of dormant for a while, and we wrote and encouraged, and we wrote and encouraged, and we called upon them to put a price on carbon, and we did lots of other things. And then finally, they've, as you know, has put a price on carbon. So, the government has done a lot. I mean, the coal-fired coal plant closures was a major undertaking. And as we know, I'm assuming all of you know, that is the largest initiative in North America in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And they should get credit for that. Absolutely. We've given them lots of kudos for that. They have put a price on carbon. They have released last June the Climate Change Action Plan, and we're waiting, but we haven't seen it yet, but they are going to be doing an update on their climate change adaptation strategy. They did one a few years ago. We haven't seen, and they've promised to redo it and come up with something. So here's a very visual way of expressing what has happened in Ontario in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. So this is electricity. So coal is online, coal is not online. So that is the major in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. This is transportation. That's not a good news story. right? This is industry. That's okay. 10 megatons from the phase out and closure of an adipic acid plant, which was 10 megatons, which is a massive reduction. But that also represents a lot of industry, unfortunately, moving out of the province or downsizing. But it, a lot of backstory to that. This is buildings. So again, that's natural gas primarily. And then these are agriculture and waste. So not a lot of change there. Meanwhile, waste, a bit of an increase there. So that's from 1990. So there's a long way to go still. Trade. So the government, as you all know, did come. We started the cap and trade this year, January 1st. We launched the government launched the cap and trade program. If I use we, I shouldn't, I'm saying Ontario, I'm not saying I'm part of the government. So I'll just do that little disclaimer right there. So the government did launch the cap and trade program January 1st. As you all know, probably the first auction was held just last week, just Wednesday. The results for that will come out on the 3rd of April. We all are waiting to see what the results are going to be. So the government did a lot of good things last year. It was a very busy policy agenda year. They came out with the new Climate Change Act. They brought out a new Climate Change Action Plan. They brought in the cap and trade. So they did a lot of policy initiatives, and they're now, from our perspective, at the implementation phase. So there's a lot going on right now in terms of implementing some of the some of the commitments that were in the Climate Change Action Plan. So they brought in the pricing, the proceeds from the sale of the allowances through the cap and trade are to be put in the greenhouse gas reduction account and spent on initiatives that support further reductions. They've enshrined targets into law, and the goal, one of the targets for 2050 is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. So the basic theory of, putting a price on carbon is it's a polluter pays principle. To get greenhouse gas reductions, you have to put a price on them. They would emit less if they had to pay for the privilege. But for polluters to take action and make the investments, they need policy stability and predictability. And this is one of the things that we talk about in our report is for industry and for large players to make decisions, they need to have policy stability. And they need to know what's going to happen 5 years down the road or more. Investments are made on a much longer term basis than political. So one of the recommendations that we made in our report was that the government should follow the UK example and set legally binding carbon budgets well in advance. The UK sets carbon budgets 12 years in advance so that there's a broad understanding of what the targets are. Where is the government wanting to go? So this is one of the recommendations that we made in our report. So that was one of the recommendations that we made. So I don't need to tell this audience the difference between a carbon tax and a cap and trade. There's a very simple schematic diagram to explain the difference. Carbon tax is simpler to understand, it's faster to implement. Cap and trade lower the costs, the economy, and it doesn't include the term tax, which is political. A lot of governments. The cap, here's the theory. Again, you issue a number of allowances, permits to pollute. Emitters over the course of the compliance period, which in Ontario is a 4-year compliance period. They have to purchase, I'm going to assume this audience understands the mechanisms of the cap and trade, but they have to purchase the allowances equal to the emissions. And at the end of the compliance period, there's a true up. They have to submit the number of allowances equal to their emissions. And if they're over, then they pay a penalty. If they're under, then they have those extra allowances that they can then trade. And that's the trading portion of it, is if they're finding that they've purchased too many allowances, they can trade them with other emitters. They're finding it hard to reduce their emissions to comply. And so they can trade the allowances in that way. So that's the cap, is the government sets an overall cap. And so it was about 142 million permits, allowances that were released, because not all of the economy is covered by the cap and trade. 2 megatons worth of allowances were issued, and they get traded. On the auction that happened last week, there was about 28 million that were put up for auction. There's 4 auctions this year. And the trade, this is how the trade happens, is those who find it easier to reduce and abate can sell their excess allowances to those that are harder. And it's the cap, it's the overall cap that gets ratcheted down over time that drives the emissions reductions. So there's a lot of issues, cap and trade design issues that in our report. Keep in mind, this is the first time that the government has done a cap and trade program. They worked very closely with California and Quebec. They're part of the Western Climate Initiative. So a number of the issues that have to be taken into consideration in designing a cap and trade program is how high is the cap? How fast does it drop? Who needs the allowances? Who pays? Competitiveness and carbon leakage, which is the issue that Kathy is raising with the border tax adjustments. Stability, predictability, cost, fairness, etc. So some of the things that you evaluate, we would be evaluating it, are the emissions reductions going to happen? Cost effectiveness of it, is the market functioning well, and is there carbon leakage? In other words, is industry moving out of the province because of the carbon price? So the way that the Ontario system was designed is sort of our efforts to schematically diagram it, so it explains it in a graphic. Transportation fuel distributors need to purchase the allowance. They need allowances. Costs are passed on to customers. The natural gas distributors here, those 2 plus a bit of electricity from natural gas generators is worth about 100 megatons. This group here they need allowance, and these 2 sectors, agriculture and waste, don't require allowances. The question is, well, who pays and who doesn't pay? I mean, directly pay. Everybody pays. Citizens pay. We know that. But who pays for the allowances? So here, liquid fuel and natural gas distributors, they have to pay. They pay indirectly because they can pass those costs on to their customers. Okay, so these are the 2 areas. These are the mandatory entities that will be passing on the cost to their customers. Industry, as you probably are all well, there was the decision taken to allocate most of the allowances to industry for free, and until 2020, and then these do not need allowances, as I've said. So one of the recommendations that we made following on this, because this issue is controversial about the allocation of free allowances. So one of the recommendations that was in our report was Ontario upon the government to be more transparent about which entities are receiving free allowances and why. So we have various recommendations. I didn't pull them all out and put them in the slide deck, but that's another one that we made. And we said, there needs to be some clear transparency, because other organizations such as the Eco-Fiscal Commission said, really the emissions intensive trade exposed industries, there's a very small portion of them that actually need the free allowances to help them transition into a lower carbon economy. So that's the second recommendation that we made. This was ultimately our conclusions. I mean, you can read our report, but ultimately we said it's reasonable, it's appropriate for the economy. The challenges are, it's complicated, it will take time to work, and it needs longer term certainty. So we didn't weigh in on the cap, and we didn't weigh in on carbon tax. Our office in the past has always said we need a price on carbon. We remained agnostic about carbon tax price. We just always have said we needed a price on carbon. So in the design of the Ontario system, they have linked with California and Quebec. And we did spend a lot of time in our report talking about the impact of linking with Quebec and California in particular. The overall for the economy, the modeling that was done for the government, and we don't have any reason to dispute that, was for the government on an economy-wide basis, it would be cheaper for emitters to have access to the larger pool of reductions of allowances that, reductions opportunities exist in other jurisdictions. It reduces carbon leakage, and it's a more liquid market, so it allows the market to function a bit better. the consequences, as I'm sure you are all familiar, is, and we have said that there is an outflow of cash to California. I mean, yes, we identified that in our report. One of the things we also said, though, was as if the carbon price does incentivize less purchases of fossil fuels for transportation fuels, then that may be offset by a corresponding amount of fossil fuel imports. So it could be a wash. That's one of the things we looked at in the report. The concern, though, also is does it lock in reliance on imported allowances from California? And so that raises that question. We tried to unpack it a bit in the report. And the question then also, as you'll see, is there's a lot of issues going on in California right now. Their cap and trade program is being has a number of legal challenges that it's facing. There's some litigation that's been launched. And also the question is whether or not it will be reauthorized after 2020. So we all know that there's some challenges going on in the United States in the climate scene in general. And in particular, this is some of the problems that we've identified going on in California. Indications are, I'd like to be optimistic. I think the California system is still going to continue. I think they're pretty. I was just reading today. There's some legal opinion that's saying it looks pretty safe. But one of the recommendations that we did make is that Ontario needs a contingency plan for the possibility that California's cap and trade may not continue. So if we're going to hook our wagon onto California, then we need to understand what will happen if that system is not moving forward. The other component of the cap and trade program is the offsets. So again, I'm going to assume this audience is familiar with what offsets are. The government has indicated that it's going to move forward with 13 offset protocols, and it's going to prioritize these top three: mine methane, landfill gas, ozone depleting substances, and refrigerants. So these are the top three. And so offsets are basically allowing emitting entities, mandatory covered entities, to meet their compliance obligations by purchasing offsets or reductions that have happened outside of the cap. And a lot of controversy about offsets. The protocols are in the process of being drafted. In Ontario, any covered entity can only meet its compliance obligations by using up to 8% of offsets. So there's a threshold in terms of how much offsets they can, how much offsets they can use to meet their compliance obligations, and it's 8%. So one of the things that we said in our report was, okay, there are other co-benefits that come with creating offsets in Ontario. There's you can get improved air quality, you can get jobs, you can get a number of other co-benefits that are associated with developing offsets in Ontario. And so what we said, the government must prioritize the approval of offset protocols to create a timely and ample supply. The key words here are high quality Ontario offsets. So there's lots of concerns around offsets being created and then being traded on the market and don't really represent real reductions. And so the question of quality is one that our office will be focused on very much going forward. And then, this is some of the information that the government put out. I don't know if the resolution is, the price impact of the cap and trade program. Now, the $5 a month for heating, is what the government has indicated, around $8 a month for transportation fuels based at a 4.3. The goal, as you know, is to recycle the proceeds back into investments that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things that the government had originally indicated that it would do would be to subsidize electricity pricing. And our office took a look at that and said, that doesn't look like a greenhouse gas reduction to us, because Ontario's electricity supply, as we know, is very clean, right? We have lots of nuclear on the grid, but it's relatively clean. And so one of the things that we did in our report is, we said to the government, that is not an acceptable use of the revenues. You can't take them and put them into electricity subsidies because that's not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this raises the question on how does the money get spent? So we know that there's a lot of money that will be raised either through the auctioning process, and the commitment of the government is to put it into the greenhouse gas reduction account, 1.8 billion per year, depending on how the auction goes. We don't know how it's going to go yet. Mostly from people who buy petroleum products and natural gas, and it will go into, here's the auction. It's not a fee and dividend. I mean, you guys know that. It's not coming back to the public and taxpayers, but it is going into the greenhouse gas reduction account, which is the requirement for the spending of that money is here, and it's in a very unhelpful yellow. I need to get that changed. So it's basically to support the reduction of further greenhouse gas emissions, okay? The government did come out with its climate change action plan. Some of the initiatives in the climate change action plan are the ones that the government had earmarked for spending going forward. As you'll see in our report, some initiatives have already received down payments of money, even though the auctions haven't happened. But so one of the roles of our office will be to be looking at the money and how is it being spent, and really trying to hold the government to account that the money is not a slush fund. It's not to go into general revenues. It really must be spent on greenhouse gas reduction activities. And part of what we've also argued for is that it needs to be additional. There needs to be some sense of additionality, because if those activities would have happened anyhow, then that's why did we need to have the money go into the government coffers, right? So it needs to be additional, and because it's not a tax, there's a legal argument behind why they can't just take the money and do what they want with it, like a tax. So so then the next chapter of our report looks at the climate change action plan. It's 5 years. It's given a bunch of initiatives that the government will be proposing in terms of what they do with the money. It's lots of things are in there. So one of the things that's in there is, focusing on land use and transit. As you probably all are aware, they are working towards a green bank. They've just finished finalizing the regulation to establish the green bank. So it's an entity. We just learned from the government last week that that's moving forward. Now they need to staff up and start flowing money to that, which is to facilitate emissions reductions opportunities with industry, households, etc. So one of the things that we talk about is the clean tech companies and the funding requirements. We think it's legitimate use. Because there's often this valley of death as clean tech companies sort of ramp up. So this is an area where some money could be spent to help these companies ramp up if they are, in fact, contributing to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So as I said before, one of the things so we looked at some of the claims that the government was making, both in the climate change action plan. And we said they indicated that they would be, as I said, subsidizing the global adjustment, subsidizing electricity prices, and that was going to get 3 megatons of reduction. And our office took a look at that and said, no, there's not 3 megatons of reductions to be had if you subsidize electricity prices. The other one that they talked about in the climate change action plan is the renewable fuel regulation, which they're moving forward with. The ballpark figure that is in the climate change action plan is 2 megaton reduction. So we said, okay, plausible, but we are calling on the government to also look at mental impacts that would be associated with moving hard in that direction. And then the industrial transformation, again, this is outside of the impact of the cap and trade. So separate from the impact of cap and trade, which has been calculated at bringing a 2.8 megaton reduction. They also had indicated a 2.5 megaton from industrial transformation, and we took a look at it to the best that we could and said, well, we don't really see any mechanisms for that actually happening. So we did the evaluation and we said, okay, there's a 24 megaton compliance gap. Here's the cap and trade, 2.8. Here's the action plan, about 2.5, or maybe I've got it backwards there. And then here's the other, so what else is going to go in here if they're really going to be meeting the 2020 reduction? So what else is in there? And this is kind of the question that we asked is, are there going to be other reductions? We don't know. Are they going to be met with offsets? But of course, offsets can only be used to 8% compliance obligation. Are they going to be purchasing California allowances? And also there's something called the early reduction credits, which are credits that will be granted for action that was taken prior to the launch of the cap and trade. So we're not sure that, there's this, calling it a compliance gap is a bit of a misnomer. It's the gap that exists to reach 2020, really. And it's not compliance, but it's meeting the target. So after the action plan, there's still lots to do, right? How do you build a low carbon economy? What do we need to do to make Ontario resilient from an adaptation perspective? So the final chapter in our report is, knowledge and action equal hope. There's lots of progress that has happened over the years, over the last little year. As I say, I've been at this since about 2008. It was all exciting back in 2008, kind of fell into the doldrums. We're back in the exciting period, which is good. So, there's encouraging international, national, and provincial progress. You all know the Pan-Canadian framework has come out. There's the Paris Agreement, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which address the hydrofluorocarbons, which are a very significant greenhouse gas, and a carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. So there's, and despite the US election and recent news, so there is some hope. And then we conclude with, the one question that everyone always says, is what can I do, right? When Diane goes around, when the commissioner goes around the province and talks to people, that typically is one of the questions that she gets asked at the end is, well, what can I do? Well, I'm sorry, it's in the terrible unreadable yellow that you can't see that. But, so reduce your carbon footprint. And I put some more words in here because really to think about what are all the aspects that we need to be focusing on as an individual? Food consumption. So we were talking earlier about food consumption. We know that meat consumption is a major greenhouse gas emitter. Transportation patterns. How are you getting around? How many people have you got in your car? How far are you driving every day? Are you driving a car? Those kinds of questions. Get ready to adapt. There's lots of things that need to be done there. This says, if you can't read it here, speak up and speak out, both to your politicians and friends. And I think that is really important. I think it's not, it is speaking up to politicians, exactly what you're doing, because they need to hear this. They really need to hear this. And then put your money where your mouth is, both on your personal consumption habits and also in your investments. And one of the things that our office has begun to start looking at is, think about it officially, but we've been engaging with some of the pension plans around, well, where are the pension plan investments? Where, as a member of a pension plan in Ontario, the Ontario Pension Board, well, where's our money being invested? And so really sort of engaging in that conversation. And that's something that the commissioner is very interested in as well. So lots of food for thought. So the one thing I didn't do is I didn't do the little show and tell. So this is the report here, and I brought 10 copies of the report. You please pick them up. I don't want to bike home with them. They're heavy to carry. So take a report if you haven't got it. I brought a whole bunch of the executive summary of the report. You can take that. All of these things are downloadable from our website. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which I really apologize, I should have printed out another copy on our website. We did last year, we did a little primer on cap and trade. And so for climate nerds, like I heard some of you referring to yourselves earlier. So this is a primer on cap and trade. And it really is a technical document to just explain the mechanics of cap and trade and how it all works. So this is something that's available on our website. We didn't hard copy produce it. One of the things that our office has also done in the past year is, so as I said, we have an energy team that we report on energy conservation as well. And so of course the two are aligned. Energy and climate change, they're, kind of related. So in the fall, in December of 2016, the government was consulting on the long-term energy plan. and our office, and in particular the energy team, took a look at the long-term energy plan that was being put out by the Ministry of Energy, and said, but wait a second, this long-term energy plan, if you go forward with that, that doesn't match the climate targets. Like, how can you do that? Because they're not aligned. So this report, I only brought one copy of it. You can take it, but you can also download that from our website. But it was really to try and say, this is across the government mandate. And so you can't stay in your silos anymore. You know, energy can't go along and merrily create a long-term energy plan that doesn't align with the targets that the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change is. Like, so this was really a good report that came out to sort of poke at where are those disconnects across government. And that's something that our office is always very interested in learning about and thinking about. Is where are the disconnects? We're doing some things on one hand and we're doing something on the other hand, and we're just two ships in the night. So we try to focus on the ministry silos to get things moving across across government. And I think I'm going to stop there with about 5 minutes left on my time. So, okay.
That was, I gotta say it in here so everybody in Cyberland can hear it. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was so informative. Tomorrow we are lobbying the Minister of Energy, so I'm taking this document. Okay. Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Is that okay? I'll surprise. Cheryl has a question. Can you say it in the microphone though, please?
Nancy, thank you so much for that. Shall stand. Thank you. That was really, really informative. And I want to thank you and the work that your colleagues do at the Commissioner's Office. My question is with regards to what the national government is planning to do. And that is put together a backstop carbon price that will rise every year. And in fact, we're going to launch an open letter from the business community asking that rising price continue beyond 2022. So as the price increases, or as the floor rises,
yep.
It's going to get a little bit more expensive. Carbons as it should, because that's going to probably, but it's expensive and it's going to hurt people. Yeah. So while it's all well and good that a lot of this money is returned to green projects, how can the government deal with regressivity, which is a real political issue? Because if the public is screaming and yelling about this, then that is going to put a real fly in the ointment in terms of, you know, the success of a carbon price. Yeah. So what would be your and the Commissioner's response to that, or a solution?
In terms of where should the revenues go? Yeah. I am not going to answer that in terms of what should happen, because that's a political decision. That's a political decision in terms of where, you know, that's where the politicians decide what to do with the money. And I think, you know, it's like any form of tax policy, what they do with the revenues, you know, what they need to do. If I'm going to say, if they're going to stay with a cap and trade program, then it really has to be apparent that there is a public benefit associated with the rising price in carbon. There's no other way. Otherwise, I mean, you know, so those are your options. And ultimately, I think, you know, if they return it to citizens, I mean, I guess the one advantage that I see, both of them, if they're designed properly, are going to increase in price. We know, and that has to happen. The one advantage of a cap and trade, for example, is that gives a significant amount of money to government to do large infrastructure investments. Okay. If you return it back to the citizens, that's fine. But then, you know, then you need money to do those large infrastructure investments to come from somewhere else. So it's a political decision in terms of what they do with the revenues. I don't have an answer in terms of the regressivity. I mean, I guess I look at what's happened in British Columbia with the carbon tax, and that price has frozen. No government has decided to raise it for a few years. I think, you know, so I guess this is where governments really need to communicate the benefits of moving forward and the risks. I mean, fundamentally the risks, but most importantly for any carbon pricing policy, in my mind, there's got to be a communication of all the benefits that go along with it. And I mean, right now you're hearing a lot of people screaming about electricity prices, right? That is the current meme in our, you know, it doesn't matter that like most of the price increase is not necessarily coming. Some of it's coming from renewables, but a lot of it was coming from, you know, nuclear and historic transmission, not putting money in. But so and politicians are really sensitive to those price questions. So it's a tough nut. I don't have any really good answers for you on that one. I wish I did. I really wish I did.
Great question. And I think we're out of time because we also want to get a picture with Nancy, if that's okay. So, yeah, so I just want to say goodbye to everybody in Cyberland. So I'll do that quickly, and then we're going to get a picture. So good night, everyone. Just note that in May and June, we will be asking our citizen climate lobbyists across Canada to lobby their provincial governments for improvements in their provincial carbon pricing policies. Basically, we're asking them to keep coordinating with their provincial territorial partners as well as the federal government, and help make sure that price goes onward and upwards and includes border tax adjustments on every provincial policy going forward. So thank you very much, Nancy, for being here tonight. That was really going to help us going forward.